Right. So this is part two of Art and Mass Culture by Max Horkheimer. It's right here. Okay. The dogmatists succumb to relativism and conformism not only in their discussion of abstract aesthetic problems, but also in their views of the moral significance of art. There is no question, says Adler, that prudence should govern art to whatever extent the work of art or the artist comes within the sphere of morality. End quote. One of the main purposes of Adler's book is to discover principles for art education. The concept of morality, which he advances for this, is, however, as unhistorical as his concept of art. Quote, crime is only one kind of antisocial behavior. Any behavior which does not conform to established customs is antisocial in essentially the same sense. Men who act antisocial, whether criminally or contrary to the custom, generally prevailing, are in the same sense morally vicious. End quote. He recognizes the difficulty arising from the fact that different views and customs prevail in different social strata, but he thinks that the resulting practical difficulties do not impair his principle. The problem simply becomes one of fixing upon which mores are more and which are less desirable for society as a whole. This problem, moreover, only exists for him when there is a conflict between the prevailing habits of different social groups and not when there is a conflict between an individual and all the groups, a situation which incidentally contains within itself the most serious moral problems of all. Thus, with regard to morality, the disparity is obliterated between the principles of metaphysics and those of positivism. Adler is irresistibly led to conclusions drawn long ago by Lévi-Breuil and other sociologists. What is moral is determined by the positive content of existing customs and habits, and morality consists in formulating and approving what is accepted by the prevailing social order. But even if the whole of society, such as the coordinated German nation, is of one mind in this regard, it still does not follow that its judgment is true. Error has no less often united men than truth. Error has no less often united men than truth. Even though truth, for of its nature, coincides with the common interest, it has usually been at loggerheads with the sentiment of the community at large. Socrates was put to death for asserting the rights of his conscience against the accepted Athenian religion. According to Hegel, the sentence was just, for the individual must, quote, must bend before the general power, and the real and the noblest power is the nation, end quote. And yet, according to Hegel, the principle Socrates upheld was superior to this one. Contrariety is even more pronounced in Christianity, which came to the world as a scandal. The first Christians, Christians impugned the generally prevailing customs, and were therefore persecuted in line with the prevailing law and mores. But this did not make them morally depraved, as would follow from Adler's definition. On the contrary, they were the ones to unmask the depravity of the Roman world. Just as the essence of art cannot be arrested through rigid supratemporal principles, ideas such as justice, morality, and public cannot be interconnected through rigid supratemporal relations. Kierkegaard's doctrine that the spread of Christianity in the public consciousness has nowise overcome the true Christian wary attitude of the state is more valid today than ever. Quote, for the concept of the Christian is a polemic concept. It is possible to be a Christian only in the opposition to others, or in a matter opposed to that of others. End quote. Those modern apologists were ill-advised who attempted to validate the attitude of the church toward witch burning as a concession to popular ideas. Truth can make no pacts with the prevailing customs. It finds no guiding thread in them. In the era of witch hunts, opposition to the public spirit would have been moral. Adler's book breathes the conviction that mankind must orient to fixed values, as these have been set forth by great teachers, above all Aristotle and St. Thomas. To positivism and relativism, he opposes sturdy Christian metaphysics. It is true that modern disbelief does find itself theoretical expression in scientificism, which explains that binding values exist for psychological reasons, because there is no need for them. So sorry, because there is a need for them. Success, which in Calvinism was not the same as being a member of the elect, but was only an indication that one might be, becomes the only standard of human life. In this way, according to Adler, positivism grants a charter to fascism. For if there can be no meaningful discussion of questions of value, action alone decides. Metaphysics draws from this a conclusion advantageous to itself. Since the denial of eternal principles handicaps the struggle against the new barbarism, the old faith must be reestablished. Men are asked to risk their lives for freedom, democracy, the nation. Such a demand seems absurd when there are no binding values. Metaphysics alone, Adler supposes, can give humanity the hold it has lost. Metaphysics makes true community possible. Such ideas misconstrue the present historical situation. Positivism, indeed, articulates the state of mind of the unbelieving younger generation, and it does so adequately as sport and jazz. The younger no longer have faith in anything, and for this reason they are able to shift to any belief. But the fault lies just as much with the dogmatism they have forgotten as with themselves. The middle class confined religion to a kind of reservation. Following Hobbes's advice, they swallowed its doctrines whole, like pills, and never completely questioned its truth. Religion, for modern men, tended to be a memory of childhood. With the disintegration of the family, the experiences that have invigorated religion also lose their power. Today, men exercise restraints not out of belief, but out of hard necessity. That is why they are so saddened. The weaker they are, and the more deeply disappointed, the more violent do they espouse brutality. They have cast aside all ties to the principle of heavenly love. Any demand that they should return to it for reasons of state is not tenable in religious terms. Religion has a claim on faith, not insofar as it is useful, but insofar as it is true. Agreement between political and religious interests is by no means guaranteed. The naive presupposition of such agreement, made by those who defend absolute values, confutes their doctrines. Positivism is as strongly in conformity with our time as Adler thinks, but it contains an element of honesty for that very reason. The young who adopt this philosophy exhibit greater property of mind than those who, out of pragmatic motives, bow to an absolute in which they do not quite believe. Uncritical return to religion and metaphysics is as questionable today as the road back to the beautiful paintings and compositions of classicism, no matter how intensely such heavens may beckon. The revivals of Greek and medieval philosophers, such as Adler recommends, are not so far remote from certain revivals of melodies by Bach, Mozart, and Chopin in current popular music. Adler denounces in impressive passages the hopeless spiritual plight of the young. He unmasks the religion of science and the religion of the state. But it will be a fatal misunderstanding to summon the young away from these doctrines and lead them back to older authorities. What is to be deplored is not that scientific thought has replaced dogmatism, but rather that such thought, still pre-scientific in the literal sense, is always confined within the limits of very specialized disciplines. It is wrong to rely on science so long as the formulations of its problems is conditioned by an obsolete division into disciplines. Economy of thought and technique alone do not exhaust the meaning of science, which is also will to truth. The way toward overcoming positivistic thinking does not lie in a regressive revision of science, but in driving this will to truth further until it conflicts with present reality. Illuminating insights are not to be found in high and eternal principles, with which everybody agrees anyways, who does not profess faith in freedom and justice, or in the routine arrangement of facts into customary patterns. Preference for static principles was the great delusion of Husserl's original eidetics, one of the precursors of Neo-Thomism. Adler seems to fall into the same error. Sublime principles are always abstract. Positivism is right in speaking here of fictions or auxiliary constructions, but insights always refer to the particular. In the process of cognition, each concept, which in isolation has its conventional meaning, takes part in forming new configurations in which it acquires a new and specific logical function. Aristotle's metaphysics, taken as a whole, marks such a configuration, as do the doctrines of St. Thomas, on whom Adler draws. The categories become distorted or meaningless unless they enter a new, more adequate structures that are required by the particular historical situation in which they play a part. The reason for this is not that each period has its own truth assigned to it, as historical and sociological relativism would like us to believe, or that one can dispense with philosophical and religious traditions, but rather that intellectual loyalty, without which truth cannot exist, consists both in preserving past insights and contradicting and transforming them. Abstract formulations of the highest values are always adjustable to the practice of stake and guillotine. Knowledge really concerned with values do not look to higher realms. It rather tries to penetrate the cultural pretenses of its time in order to distinguish the features of a frustrated humanity. Values are to be disclosed by uncovering the historical practice that destroys them. In our time, thinking is endangered not so much by the wrong paths it may pursue as by its being prematurely cut short. Positivism rests content with the prearranged routines or official science, whereas metaphysics invites intuitions that have their content in the prevailing modes of consciousness. The demand for purity and clarity, applicability, and matter-of-factness, which is immediately raised to challenge any act of thinking that is not free from imagination, expresses a repugnance to going beyond the limitations of the statement, to the intellectual restlessness and negativism, all of which are indispensable elements of thought. The truth of ideas is demonstrated not when they are held fast, but when they are driven further. The pedantry of matter-of-factness produces, conversely, a fetishism of ideas. Today, ideas are approached with a sullen seriousness. Each, as soon as it appears, is regarded as either a ready-made prescription that will cure society or a poison that will destroy it. All the ambivalent traits of obedience assert themselves in the attitude to ideas. People desire to submit to them or to rebel against them, as if they were gods. Ideas begin by playing the role of professional guides and end as authorities and Führers. Whoever articulates them is regarded as a prophet or a heretic, as an object to be adored by the masses, or as a prey to be hunted by the Gestapo. This taking of ideas only as verdicts, directives, signals characterizes the enfeebled man of today. Long before the era of the Gestapo, his intellectual function had been reduced to statements of facts. The movement of thought stops short at slogans, diagnoses, and prognoses. Every man is classified bourgeois, communist, fascist, Jew, alien, or one of us. And this determines the attitude once and for all. According to such patterns, dependent masses and dependable sages throughout the world history have always thought. They have been united under ideas, mental products that have become fetishes. Thinking, faithful to itself, in contrast to this, knows itself at any moment to be whole and to be uncompleted. It is less like a sentence spoken by a judge than like the prematurely interrupted last words of a condemned man. The latter looks upon things under a different impulsion than that of dominating them. Adler appreciates the public as it is, and in consequence, popularity is a positive criterion to him. He treats the film as popular poetry and encompasses with it the theater of Elizabethan period, when for the first time writers had the double role of artist and merchant competing in a free market for both plaudits and profits. According to him, the middle class theater has been determined by market economy and democracy. Communist or sentimental aristocrats may regret commercialization, says Adler, but its influence on Shakespeare was not so bad. The film must please not merely the masses, but beyond them, the organized groups which have become the unofficial custodians of public manners and the common good. Adler does realize the difficulties encountered by the film as compared with the theater because of the size of its public and the differentiated needs of modern society, but he overlooks the dialectics of popularity. Quite against his intention to differentiate and evaluate social phenomena, his static way of thinking tends to level everything. Just as he's tempted to confuse Raphael's and Disney's scenic backgrounds, he seems to identify the Hayes office and the guardians of the Platonic Republic. His whole approach to film as an art bears witness to the confusion of entirely different cultural orders. He defends the movies against the accusation that they are not art because of the collective character of their production. But the discrepancy between art and film, which exists despite the potentialities of the motion picture, is not the result of the surface phenomena of the number of people employed in Hollywood as much as of the economic circumstances. The economic necessity for rapid return of the considerable capital invested in each picture forbids the pursuit of the inherent logic of each work of art of its own autonomous necessity. What today's called popular entertainment is actually demands evoked, manipulated, and by implication, deteriorated by the cultural industries. It has little to do with art, least of all where it pretends to be such. Popularity has to be understood with reference to social change, not merely as a quantitative but as a qualitative process. It was never directly determined by the masses, but always by the representatives in other social strata. Under Elizabeth, and even as late as the 19th century, the educated were the spokesmen for the individual. Since the interests of the individual and those of the rising middle class did not fully coincide, the works of art always contain a crucial element. Ever since that time, the concept of individual and society have been reciprocal ones. The individual developed in harmony with and in opposition to society. Society developed when individuals did, and it developed when individuals didn't. In the course of this process, social mechanisms such as the national and international divisions of labor, crisis and prosperity, war and peace strengthened their own independence of the individual who became increasingly alien to them and faced them with growing impotence. Society slipped away from individuals and individuals from society. The cleavage between private and social existence has taken on catastrophic proportions towards the end of the liberalistic period. New forms of social life are announcing themselves in which the individual as he is will be shaped unless he is destroyed. But the educated are still indissolubly bound up with man as he existed in the past. They still have in mind the individual harmony and culture, at a time when the task is no longer to humanize the isolated individual, which is impossible, but to realize humanity as a whole. And when Goethe had to concede that his ideal of the harmonious personality had foundered. In our own time, the pursuit of this ideal presupposes not only indifference towards the general suffering, but the very opposite of the ideal, a distorted personality. In Europe, representation and leadership of the masses has shifted from the educated to powers more conscious of their task. Criticism in art and theory has been replaced by actual hatred or by the wisdom of obedience. The opposition of individual and society and of private and social existence, which gave seriousness to the pastime of art, has become obsolete. The so-called entertainments, which have taken over the heritage of art, are today nothing but popular tonics, like swimming or football. Popularity no longer has anything to do with the specific content or the truth of artistic productions. In the democratic countries, the final decision no longer rests with the educated but with the amusement industry. Popularity consists of the unrestricted accommodation of the people to what the amusement industry thinks they like. For the totalitarian countries, the final decision rests with the managers or direct and indirect propaganda, which is by its nature indifferent to truth. Competition of artists in the free market, a competition in which success was determined by the educated, has become a race for the favor of the powers that be, the outcome of which is influenced by the secret police. Supply and demand are no longer regulated by social need, but by reasons of state. Popularity in these countries is a little result of the free play of forces as any other prize. In other countries, it shows a similar tendency. In a beautiful passage of his book, Dewey explains that communication is the consequence and not the intention of the artistic work. Quote, indifference to response of immediate audience is a necessary trait of all artists that have something new to say. End quote. Today, even the imaginary future audience has become questionable because once again, man within humanity is as solitary and abandoned as humanity within the infinite universe. But the artist, continues Dewey, quote, are animated by a deep conviction that since they can only say what they have to say, the trouble is not with their work, but those who, having eyes, see not, and having ears, hear not. End quote. The only hope remaining is that the deaf ears in Europe imply an opposition to the lies that are being hammered at men from all sides, and that men are following their leaders with their eyes tight shut. One day we may learn that in the depths of their hearts, the masses, even in fascist countries, secretly knew the truth and disbelieved the lie, like catatonic patients who make known only at the end of their trance that nothing has escaped them. Therefore, it may not be entirely senseless to continue speaking a language that is not easily understood. Okay.